This week in the conversation, I have the honor to receive out of Riverside, Southern California, fantasy author Paul Joseph Santoro Emerick. We're going to be talking about his fantastic novel titled Swordbane. Interesting novel. But before we get into this interesting story, I'd just like to give you a quick update on the Bittersweet Memories of Last Spring. I'm still getting email, people wanting to know exactly where they can find the book. At this point, I'm beginning to think it's just a little gimmick they try to pull on me. Of course, the book is selling everywhere, including Walmart. If you go to Walmart online, you can still find Bittersweet Memories of Last Spring. So also, I just want to remind everyone that it is important to continue to lend your support behind our YouTube channel. I have to say this because, the best way to show your support, if you truly believe in the power of words on such a fascinating thing in our life, which is literature, you need to support this channel. And the best way to do so is to subscribe to it. Not just you subscribing to it, but also you need to tell your friends and fans to do the same. So that way, you can keep the conversation going. And also, if you subscribe to this channel, don't forget to click the notification bell so that way every time a video is posted, it will go directly into your portable. So let's get started. Again, my name is Ardain Isma, and I'm here this evening with a compelling author. I'm here with Paul Joseph Santoro Emerick. We're going to be talking about his fantastic fantasy novel titled Swordbane. So, Paul, welcome to the conversation.
Thank you, Ardain. Glad to be here.
Okay. Paul, so every time we have a new author in the conversation, I always have to ask the author to present himself or herself to the audience of CSMS Magazine. So, Paul, would you please tell the audience who is Paul Joseph Santoro Emerick?
Okay. Well, hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning in. I am the author of Swordbane. My name is Paul Joseph Santoro Emerick. Just a little spiel about me. I work as a teacher in Riverside County in Southern California. I'm a public education teacher for independent study. Previously, I was also serving as a veteran, in active duty at the time in the U.S. Navy as a gunner's mate. And before that, just everyone else who's in the youth, high school, growing up in Southern California and getting to appreciate the warm weather.
In California, right?
That is correct, yes.
Okay.
Born and raised.
In Southern California, if you're talking about the warm weather, right?
Yes.
Okay. All right, so in Florida also, it's so warm and hot. Although I live in North Florida, but still, it's still hot. So, and I can't wait for the weather to change because right now it's switching into autumn. So I'm just keeping my fingers crossed, Okay. So, Paul, interesting Swordbane story. And you know what? What really catches my attention is the different facets that you have beneath the story itself. I know you say this book is an epic fantasy novel with a deep fantasy-based plot that delves into aspects of issues we face today, including dealing with a pandemic, ending a 20-year-old prolonged war, social unrest, corruption, and historical revisionism. But before we get to that, Paul, all right, let me ask you this question. How did you come up with a story that includes the different aspects of our lives as a society? How did you come up with this?
Well, living through it in the COVID pandemic times that we are in. That was really it. Just relating to my students when I see them each day, thinking about what's on the news. I really do pay attention to news and politics, and it affects our, everyday lives. So I was really thinking of what can I do to find something for people to relate to that we go through every day, and put those aspects into a fantasy story that we can maybe enjoy or find something meaningful. And that's basically just behind it.
And you know what? These are the subjects that do not, women within the boundaries of young people. These are the things that we as parents, as adults, we deal every day, and especially during the past 3 years of the pandemic. So let's dive into it. It's a dark plot unfolds in the western lands of the kingdom of Swordbane, with the formation of an unholy alliance. What do you mean by unholy alliance? Could you please educate the audience about that, Paul?
Okay. So the Unholy Alliance, you could say, is basically a first time between one vassal of a king. So you can almost picture in your mind a medieval type of society, a feudal society.
Right.
And basically there is a vassal who is deciding to do something that hasn't been done before, where he becomes disillusioned, disenfranchised with the current setting, the lack of attention from the king, and he decides he is going to take up a role of being a Dark Lord and making an alliance with whoever would join him, and basically pursuing this type of historical revisionism. You can almost think of a parallel of Putin, Russia, and Ukraine.
Okay. Before we get to that, I was going to get to that in a second. On chapter 2, Paul,
okay,
page 5. In that war, you said there was a siege, and the siege itself was a 6-month siege, and was the climax, I would say, of a lengthy, drawn-out war that lasted roughly 20 years. Now, if we're talking about a 20-year war, basically the war in Afghanistan lasted about 20 years. Was that what you had in mind when you were writing these lines?
That, in a big sense, was a parallel. So in a large part, it was as a parallel to the, to Afghanistan, the U.S. Presence there, the occupation there for about 20 years. So that was my little parallel in that aspect of the story, to find a way to get the reader to relate to, again, our current setting, and then making a fantasy parallel into the story.
This is great. And also you refer to a very something very that catches my attention greatly. You talk about historical revisionism. Now, can you please, Paul, educate us on what do you mean by, historical revisionism? Because I know I've heard this before, and I know exactly what it is, but for the purpose of an audience, that we're trying to educate this evening, can you please tell us a little bit?
Okay, you might actually know more in terms of better defining it than I would, but I think in terms of examples. So I guess that's the best way I'll try to approach or define it. But basically, if you think of a modern day leader like Vladimir Putin in Russia,
right,
and you're going to say, well, he's an example in pursuing historical revisionism. Basically, he is pursuing what he re-envisions in a way of restoring or rebuilding what was like a great envisioned belief of what Russia was, or the Soviet Union, where he wants to go back to that, almost like nostalgia. And that has happened in different points in history, you could say, where you could have a given political leader where they're pursuing something just like that, in the sense of revisionism, where they want to go back to what was a greater time. You have that basically right before World War II or during World War II, when you think of Benito Mussolini in Italy and wanting to go back to making and restoring this great re-envisioned modern form of a Roman Empire. So in the story I tell, basically that vassal that's rebelling against the king, you can think of him wanting to go back and restore this great empire that was kind of an analogy to a Roman Empire. And in that sense, that's the best way I can explain revisionism. It's hard for me to define it versus explaining it with examples.
Yeah, and you know what? Which referring to the Russians, and in particular the flamboyant president who is Vladimir Putin. So there's always this criticism that Vladimir Putin himself has many times criticized Lenin, who is actually the most important figure of the Russian Revolution. And but at the same token, he wants to. He said himself that the disappearance or this dissolution of the USSR was a great tragedy for humanity. He said so, but yet he's not going back to the social system that existed pre 1991.
That's
So
correct.
it's in the sense that we're saying that is revisionism is a Russian version of, we say that capitalism. Is it fair to say that? Because the thing is not the antithesis of socialism or Marxism in a sense.
Yeah.
If we want to give it an intellectual, view of it, understanding of it, Putin really isn't standing the opposite side of it.
You know, I would agree. I see it more in the broader sense of totalitarianism, where whatever the structure of the economy or the direction it goes, I think it's more of like the prestige or the influence in that sense of a leader like Putin, of where he wants Russia to be, where you might have seen in the past as being more prestigious or influential versus the present. So I guess in that way, that's how I look at revisionism, because you can look at different governments over time and you almost like question, gee, how much are on the path when they're saying or identifying as communists, even the People's Republic of China? Because I would say in a lot of ways, I still see them maybe in the social sense if they're doing legislation as being towards communists, but in the economic sense, I see them very much as being embracing capitalism and trying to have a more productive economy. But at the same time, I guess this can all overlayer into totalitarianism. It's like, well, what if you're the pilot, which direction you want to take it? But at the end of the day, when I look at Putin, I think he wants Russia to be prestigious as he once saw it, even if he has a different maybe approach to take it versus how Lenin did. It's very deep. It's hard for me to. It can be a whole long topic. So.
Right. And sometimes it could be a great tragedy when it comes to geopolitics.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah. And it's a sad story. The Ukraine story, I think, is a travesty when it comes to the suffering of the Ukrainians, whichever side you look at it, because they are the ultimate victims. They are the one dying and fighting, and so it's a very sad story. But yeah, that's what we would call historical revisionism. But also you mentioned social unrest, and this is something that exists in Western societies also, more so manifested. And you may say that because the democratic system has been installed, people are allowed to go out on the street and express their frustration, question the government officials to do things right, whether it be France or Great Britain or Germany or here in the United States. We have large demonstrations. Now, let me ask you questions now. Do you think social unrest can ultimately lead to a desired end when it comes to social justice?
I think it's almost like who's at the helm and where they take it, where I think they can. But I would think if how we define or approach social unrest, if we decide if it's going to be social unrest in the non-disobedient sense, and I mean, if you consider Martin Luther King Jr., where he was leading civil rights movements for non-violence,
right.
And if you call that civil unrest, then I think that's an example where it could go that direction. I would say in the story I have that Decius, or you can say Decius, depending on the Latin pronunciation,
right.
He takes it in a more dictator, violent type of course of action, and he is not in the nonviolent approach of doing things unless someone's going to absolutely submit to him. So in answer to your question, if we consider examples where it's non-violent, then I think it's possible. But if we're defining a civil unrest to strictly just include violence, then that could go in very bad direction. I would say it could go in very bad directions in general. It's hard for me to think where it can't, where it involves violence, unless, if you're fighting an oppressive side, almost on lines of like Nazi Germany, where you use violence, but you're restructuring society afterwards, where it's not the same, then maybe I guess that it's possible in that sense when you look at it that way. Right. I would say, yeah, it's very likely to go in a bad direction.
Right. On page 17 on chapter 4, you mentioned something. I was going to ask you about the effect of redemption and the part of the king himself. You say that he instructed Lenatus, now an adult, 11 ranger and 27 years of age, to follow him inside his personal royal tent to speak in private. Lenatus did as commanded, and when the two were alone, the king suddenly kneeled down and pleaded for forgiveness. You think that you can, no matter how sadistic a person can be, there might be somewhere or sometime in his life, we could see some element of redemption. How do you explain that the king kneeled down and pleaded for forgiveness?
So in that sense of the story, the way I was designing and interpreting it for what he was doing, he felt guilty, almost like an inward conviction of abandoning someone who helped save his daughter, like a flashback earlier in the story.
Right.
And he straight up felt like he basically neglected an example of one of the closest people that he could know, but he kind of didn't. Because after that person was in his youth with his father, Leonidas' father, they were given like a brief acknowledgement of rewards. But after that, I mean, the king was basically off on his own with his daughter, and they haven't, seen Leonidas or his family since that time. And he felt guilty of almost like the most prominent example of social neglect, where he had his attention on other matters. You can say stately matters, the war that was 20 years long. And then it kind of hits home to him that, wow, of all the things he had his attention to, this person comes back in his life. And it's almost like ironic, because just as Leonidas saved his daughter earlier in life, he's going to be the one to do it again, basically, because she's deep behind enemy lines in that siege. And it really humbles him to feel almost like he wasn't as grateful as he should be. So to me, that was the touching moment I wanted to put or instill in the reader's mind, was these characters, they're flawed in different ways. They really are. Maybe you could say more, some are more flawed than others. And the king, the king, in my opinion, I would say he's okay. I wouldn't say he's that bad, but he has his flaws. And this really comes out where he recognizes it. And that's why I wanted to point out to the readers, just that moment, that inwards conviction of his life coming out in full display.
Now, let me ask you something. You know that dystopian fantasy is becoming a new trend right now. I imagine this is something that you wouldn't mind, or maybe that would be your next book, purely dystopian, because it's pretty dark fantasy that your novel is. I have to say that I love it, because I myself wrote 7 years ago, not a fantasy book, but it was a very politically motivated book titled Midnight at Noon. It's a political novel, which was very dark also. But you use fantasy. You take me from my real world into a fantasy world. You give me that beautiful escapism that we're all trying to get. We all, it's an elusive kind of moment that we're trying to capture. when things seem kind of dark for us in the real world. So how do you see you writing dystopian fantasy?
You mean as far as like continuing it forward, or?
Yes, 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 yes.
So I'm actually currently working on the next book that follows this story 10 years later from when it ends, and again there's another deep moral. So I wanted to have a couple different themes or morals of the story to this one, to Swordbane itself.
Right.
And I'm working on a different theme for the second book with the characters and how they continue on with their lives, or you can say afterlives.
Right.
And the overall theme, or one of the main ones, is just dealing with the concept of collective sin, if you call it that, versus individual sin. And it's going to be pretty deep. I'm working through the story. I'm probably about maybe 10% through the first draft of the story that I'm working on.
Okay.
The thing I will say, if people, without giving too much of the ending, is the characters, they're back. They are back in different ways, and I mean, I guess the reader will know that even towards the end of the story.
Right.
But we'll just say for two of the characters, they will have an interesting reunion.
Okay. That's all we're gonna say now. We don't want to give up the plot now. Now, when can we expect Paul to read the next book? You say you're just at the beginning phase of it. So, do you have a timeline?
Yeah, roughly. My book, publishing consultant for the book I published for Swordbane, we were talking about that, and the best, I want to give myself some room in case I feel like I need more extra time.
Right.
But I put down at sometime in the Q1 of 2024, so more than a year from now. Okay. But if I can't pull it off like I did in the summer, because I work as a teacher, so the best time for me to get stuff done when I can would be in the summer. I would like to get it done in the summer, but if I feel like I need extra room, I don't want to disappoint if someone's into it, expecting when it's going to come out, where I have to push it back. I don't want to be in that situation. I'd rather have it where it's a conservative time to put, and if I end up finishing earlier, great. So that's the estimations, Q1 2024.
2024.
The title, I'll tell you what the title will be called. The title will be called Shimmer Frost.
Okay. And that's all we're gonna give them.
Yeah.
That's all we're gonna give them. Now, do you also, besides, do you have, are you a member of different writers group out there? Because I know in Twitter itself, there's a large writing community in which I belong. And also, I also have membership in several of them on Facebook and other social media platforms. So is it something that also you look for as you're pushing the book forward?
Currently, I'm not like an official member of any formal like writing organization or writers organization. I do join different Facebook groups, including ones for writers, and to promote the book. So in a way, it is kind of new territory for me because I only published one other book before, and I have not been that prolific in that sense of writing, unless I was doing stuff more on the academic lines, including as a teacher, being a history major. But to me, it's kind of like getting my feet wet again, where I didn't get much as wet before, and I'm exploring in that sense. So I'm just joining different Facebook groups to help promote the book, and then maybe brief talks with writers. But I have not joined any formal writing organizations per se yet.
Okay, let me ask you this question, because I know that you live in California. This is a very multicultural, multi-ethnic state. You yourself, you part of so many, as you just told me, you are Italian, British, I believe German also. So, so now every time I have a new author in the conversation, sometimes we start talking about literature and we move to something cozier. So I know that the multiculturalism, just like me, is in you. So, Paul, if I were to ask you, okay, living in California, what kind of dish that you would consider as your favorite?
What kind of dish has a what?
That you would consider as my favorite dish, my favorite cooking, things that I really love to eat if I go out with my wife or me,
Okay, and if I had to recommend one for you?
No. You yourself as an individual, which one you think? Because maybe you're teaching me something that I didn't know before in terms of cuisine. You know.
Okay. Geez, that's a tough one. I try different dishes, all kinds of different foods. Oh man. I mean, that's almost like I need to ask you to pick what cuisine, like if it's Italian, Chinese,
Exactly.
Mexican. It's just a hard one because I can pick one from each, nationality or ethnic group.
Right.
That's a tough one. I will tell you probably one of my favorite ones
Mm.
that I like, and this is really dicey if you can get it at a restaurant. It's called vongole. It's a southern Italian seafood dish, and basically it's you have mussels and they're steamed and it's cooked with garlic, like a white wine,
Right.
olive oil a little bit, pasta, linguine. I mean, you can use different types of pasta,
Right.
tomatoes, different seasonings.
Right.
So that one is probably my favorite. And
Okay.
as far as I know, the origin of that dish, it's in Naples or Napoli, Italy, in southern Italy.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Now my next question is, Paul, what is your favorite music genre?
For music genre, if you call it a genre, I mean, I like soundtrack music.
Okay.
So anytime, this is the thing, anytime I'm working on my book, I
Right.
go to like different soundtrack songs that get me in the
Really?
mood. Yeah. So I have my own ways to write where it makes it easier for me, both visual and for in the auditory sense.
Okay.
And it works for me. Everyone's different, but for me, it works. And I have different selections of soundtrack music I listen to,
Really?
include, just like the con soundtracks.
Right.
And it helps me get into the writing. So if I'm doing something that's more like a dark type of the book,
Right.
like with Decius leading an
Right.
army,
Right.
then I'm looking for a soundtrack that has a dark, edgy, quick feel to it.
Okay.
And then there's other ones that are different where it's more like an exploration type of feeling.
Right.
Then I get a soundtrack that has, like, crazy as it sounds, like a video game with an exploration theme song for the heroes and protagonists. So it's one of those things for me.
Now, I have a couple more questions for you, Paul. Listen, because I know every author has some writers or one particular writer who has been some sort of that you have been inspired, by this particular person. See, if I were to ask you who you would consider as your preferred author, it doesn't have to be an American.
Yeah, I'm tied between two.
Okay.
I picked two, or what? Is two good enough? I can narrow it to two. Or you want one? You really want one? I'll give you one. Just one. Okay, I'm gonna go with R.A. Salvatore.
Salvatore, okay.
Yeah, or Salvatore, depending on the pronunciation. But
right,
yeah,
right,
with
right,
the
right.
Drizzt Do'Urden, the Dark Elf. I just love reading his books, especially the early ones that he does, the Crystal Shard, Streams of Silver, the Halfling's Gem. So he would be it. I mean, there's one other author. I'm like, oh, that's a nail biter almost.
Okay. Now my last question. If I were to ask you, because we're reaching the end of our conversation, unfortunately. Now, is there a lesson that you would want to give to a teacher like you or a person like you who would want to dive into that fantasy world and using your own personal experiences as an individual to write a story just like this one, Swordbane? What lesson would you give that person?
And we're talking as far as the reader or the writer?
As far as the writer, not the reader.
The writer. Okay. The one lesson I would say that makes a difference is perseverance, and kind of like I gave off earlier, just knowing what's going to help motivate you to write the story that you think is worth telling. And I gave my examples, like I'm an auditory learner. I need soundtrack music to get in the vibe of what part of the story I'm telling. I actually make my own little customized map, almost like a Risk board game with different represented figures. So
Right.
it's visual. So those little things I think help in order to get the person more directed to write the story. And that's what I would say.
Okay. So on that note, I'm just going to say it's been more than a pleasure to have impeccable author, Paul Joseph Santoro Emerick, in the conversation.
Thank you, Ardain. It was an honor, and I definitely appreciate it. Thank you so much. So.